Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all in today's webinar, The Climate for Renewables, a conversation on India's energy policy. This program is brought to you by Columbia Global Centers Mumbai in collaboration with Columbia Global Centers Beijing and Center on Global Energy Policy, Columbia University. So I welcome you all once again, and for further proceedings, I am handing over the session to Dr. Ravina Agarwal, the Director for Columbia Global Centers in Mumbai.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Aditya. Welcome to this panel, The Climate for Renewables, a conversation on India's energy policy. This is the third session in a four-part series on climate policy and energy policy in Asia that is being organized by the Columbia Global Centers Mumbai in partnership with the Columbia Global Centers Beijing, as well as the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. I would welcome all of you to this very important panel and very important conversation. The Mumbai Center, like 9 other global centers of Columbia University, was established with the aim of advancing knowledge exchange, promoting research and education to answer some of the biggest challenges that the world is facing today. And energy and clean air and the future of our planet is certainly one of these, a very, very big challenge. With a population of 1.4 billion and one of the world's fastest growing major economies, India will be vital for the future of the global energy market. The current energy mix in the Indian scenario comprises of largely thermal power, almost 63%, and while some spectrum of renewable energy comprises the other part. And India's share of total global primary energy demand is set to increase from 6% to 11% by 2040. How can the policy and planning framework target the provision of energy, A, at the household, transport, and industrial level in a way that accounts for economic growth projections and population demands, and B, in a manner that reflects resilience and adaptation to growing environmental stress, carbon pollution, and the vulnerability of our natural resources? What is the country doing to move us away from fossil fuels and spur the renewable energy sector, and where do the gaps lie? I'm going to turn for this important conversation. I'm going to welcome all the speakers, and I'm particularly Sumant Sinha, who is very closely associated with the university, and also our other speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Pierre Noël, who is a global research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy. His research interests sit at the intersection between international energy markets and public policy choices. And since 2013, he has worked extensively on energy and environmental policy strategies in emerging Asia, focusing on the economic and political drivers of the competition between coal, LNG, and renewables in the context of growing concerns about the local and global environment. So I welcome you, Pierre.
Thank you very much, Ravina. Thank you to everyone who has been involved in putting this webinar together. It's a pleasure to be here. I have just a few minutes, and therefore I've decided to speak without any slides. And I apologize if most people on the call, on the webinar, already know what I will say. But I essentially, as an introduction, want to put forward 2 points. The first one is about India in the global climate change negotiation or regime. As you know, we've gone from something that was centered on the Kyoto Agreement to something that is now centered on the Paris Agreement. And the reason Kyoto collapsed is because large developing countries like India, among many others, wanted to make sure that they could prioritize on their social and economic development, that the global ambition to combat climate change would not translate into an unfair burden on them as they develop economically and socially. The fact that renewables have become cheap and in some places super cheap, and we'll hear much more about that later in this webinar, this fact is very positive. It reduces the dilemma between green energy and cheap energy. And therefore, it made it even easier for developing countries to sign on the Paris Agreement. But the key point of the Paris Agreement, of course, compared to Kyoto, is that it shifts the uncertainty away from the cost that will be borne by nations onto the environmental achievements. Therefore, the uncertainty now very much rests on whether, to what extent we will successfully address this challenge, as opposed to what amount of money are we going to spend on it. Now that President Biden has been elected, and there's this growing realization or sort of coming of age of the emergency of the climate challenge, pressure seems to be back in the climate negotiation, and pressure very much in the forms of demands from the rich world to the emerging world for clear, quantified commitments, both long-term and shorter-term. And as pressure is back, so is resistance. And we've seen in the past few weeks, India being among the countries that appear to be reluctant to agree to commitments that they are not certain they can meet, or that they do not control the cost of meeting. So we're sort of back to the Kyoto dilemma in a sense, even if cheap renewables make the dilemma less acute. What is essentially what the Indian government has been replying. What did happen to this principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which is at the heart of the UN Convention on Climate Change? So that's a very important point to keep in mind. The second one is about India's energy policy itself. It's very much focused on the rapid deployment of renewables, which India has very good conditions for, both solar and wind. And it's been a real success. And it, of course, could have been better. It can always be better. But India is even emulated in some of the instruments it's developed, such as its reverse auctions. It's emulated across the developing world for its renewable policy. So it's a real success story. However, and it's the first caveat, the impact of renewable deployments on Indian emissions has been somewhat subdued. And this is in part because the huge coal-fired fleets in the Indian electricity system is rapidly becoming more flexible. So as renewables grow, coal become more flexible, it follows the load, and therefore its use is less reduced perhaps than many people expected, and therefore CO2 emissions are also less reduced. The second caveat, of course, is as the strategy is successful, eventually the use of coal is going to be reduced, potentially dramatically, and that will have huge political implications in India with the coal mining regions and coal mining communities, but also a host of related industries, including railways. The third caveat, of course, is about greening the industrial sector, which is the other big CO2 emitting sector, a fast growing one. and one in which the technologies to reduce CO2 emissions have not come down in cost dramatically as they have in electricity generation. And therefore, the greening of industry, is a major source of uncertainty about the cost of reducing emissions for a country like India, which feeds into my first point about the comeback of pressure and the comeback of resistance in the international climate negotiations as we are going into the Glasgow meeting. So in conclusion, I would say that it's fairly certain that if only just because of the renewables revolution, India will grow in a much greener way than China has, for example. However, it is unclear to what extent renewables in themselves, cheap renewables, will take us to climate neutrality, or more precisely, at what cost will renewables via the electrification of transport, industry, be able to take us to climate neutrality. So the uncertainties, I would say, have receded compared to 20 years ago, but they certainly have not disappeared. And India certainly is still at the very center of the global climate change fights, dilemmas, negotiations, and therefore I very much look forward to the rest of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Pierre, thank you very much for your comments. This is Laurie Fitzmaurice. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. It will be my pleasure to guide the rest of the conversation, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce Sumant Sinha, who is the founder, chair, and managing director of Renew Power, and the author of the book Fossil Free that I would encourage all of you to read. It is a compelling text that will guide you through the history of energy transitions and bring you to the present day and many of the challenges around renewable energy. Sumant is an alumni of Columbia University School of International Public Affairs, and he is a passionate advocate for solutions related to climate change. He founded Renew Power in January of 2011 and has taken the company to tremendous success as part of India's renewable energy sector. Sumant, I believe that you have some slides you'd like to share with us, and then I would enjoy very much the opportunity to ask you a few questions and continue to moderate the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie. Thank you so much for that, and thank you, Pierre, for your remarks as well. Let me just take you through a very quick presentation, and then we can do the Q&A after that, if that's okay. Great. So what I'll do is I'll just take you a little bit through what I have written in the book. Really, as you said, talking about the energy transitions that we are in the midst of right now, which is still not very well recognized, although of course it's now becoming better recognized, and then a little bit about the implication for India and where India stands on this whole area of energy transition. We are actually in the midst of an energy transition of the kind that we've witnessed only a couple of times before in our history. First of all, in the 19th century, there was a transition from biomass, which is really wood burning, to coal, as we had the development and the discovery and the evolution of the steam engine. And then basically in the 20th century, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, we had also the transition not away from coal, but also a new fuel coming into the mix, which was really oil. And what we're witnessing now is a similar transition happening, which is really from the fossil fuels into clean energy. And that's something that we're only at the beginnings of, and this is something that will change and continue to become a much bigger aspect as we go forward. Now, if we look at carbon emissions, which is really one of the things that have to be looked at in terms of driving this change, and which is really how this transition started off, which was the whole recognition and realization that carbon emissions were not good for humanity, not good for the planet, and therefore had to be addressed. You can see that since over the last 50 years, carbon emissions in the world as a whole have tripled, or in fact more than tripled. And the development and economic growth in countries like China, of course, the continued prosperity in the US, and now even India is continuing to increase this carbon emissions number. And India, for its own part, while low today, as I will show in the later parts of the presentation, will in fact keep increasing, because India is just at the beginnings of the same kind of growth that we saw in China over the last many years. And so therefore India's per capita and overall carbon emissions will continue to grow. And that is obviously not going to be good globally. Now, if we look at the carbon budget, which of course is well recognized and well understood, we really are at a point where if we exceed about 800 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere, we will cross the 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade red line number in terms of temperature change. Today, there already is 600 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere, and only an additional 100 gigatons more will essentially tip us over that number of 1.5 degrees centigrade. And going as we are at about 9 gigatons every year, and that number also increasing, it means we literally have at most 10 to 15 years before we cross these red lines and achieve those numbers. So clearly, going at the current trajectory is absolutely not something that we can afford, because we will in fact cross these red line numbers. And we all know this has obviously been well documented, but we've seen that over the last 100 years or so, temperatures have definitely gone up. And you can see really from the 1960s, which is really where this long-term mean has been kept at, you can see that we've already had almost a 1 degree centigrade temperature change in the last 50, 60 years or so. And so just fast forward this by another literally 20 years, given where we are right now in carbon emissions, and we'll cross the additional 1.5 degrees centigrade. So the reality is we don't have time. We don't have time. We are continuing to emit more and more carbon into the atmosphere. And despite, of course, all the commitments that we're seeing from various countries, the longer those commitments take to take effect, the more carbon we would have already put into the atmosphere. And so it's not just a question, if you look at various countries' net zero targets, it's not just a question of what the target is at the end. It's also a question of how you get there. If you go like this and then suddenly stop, right, you'll have a lot more carbon in the atmosphere already. And so therefore, the sooner we can put a stop onto various countries' carbon emissions, the better it is. And the more urgent, therefore, and this, and the imperative is very strong to reverse. And we've, of course, seen all the issues around bushfires, cyclones, the increasing frequency of all sorts of climate events, which is leading to disrupted weather patterns and so on. And this is obviously not good. We are clearly seeing the impact of the 1 degree centigrade change already. In addition to the climate change issue, there is also the pollution issue, which in countries like India, particularly, is a very acute problem. 9 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world are actually in India, not just in India, but northern India. And this is something that leads to tremendous healthcare issues for everybody who lives there, and obviously increases healthcare costs as well, decreases productivity, decreases quality of life. So this is therefore a very big issue that also needs to be addressed. And so this is again where you have a confluence of what is good for climate change is good for the local environments and local air pollution and so on, and therefore has to be addressed very critically. Now, let's look at what are the issues at a more macro level. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at carbon emissions, this 9 gigatons of carbon emissions that is coming from all over the world, where and from which sectors is that coming from? 3/4 of that comes from energy, all forms of energy, whether it's heating or cooling or mobility or industrial usage, or of course, the power sector, right? So, and the balanced quarter of carbon emissions comes from things like agriculture and some degree of land use change, some industrial processes and some waste. But the bulk of it really comes from energy. And so we really have to critically look at the whole energy sector. and see how we can actually address the energy sector, because that is going to be critical to us dealing with this whole issue of carbon emissions in the future. And now within energy, let's look at how that whole number is shaped up. Within energy, of the 73% that we have of carbon coming from the energy sector, a quarter of it comes from the electricity sector. 14% comes from buildings, 30% from transportation, industry is about 19%, and others miscellaneous things is about 12%. And so if you think about it, the whole renewable energy area that we've been talking about really sits within that 24% bucket of the energy sector. So it's good, of course, but it's not good enough. And we have to find ways of increasing it. And so therefore, in fact, as we look to the future, you will see that we're in the midst of not just one, but two fundamental energy transitions right now. The first energy transition is the aspect of greater electrification within the energy sector, i.e. taking this 24% of electricity and making it a much bigger part of this overall pie of energy. So that's the transition number one that is happening, right? Transition number two really is how do we take that electricity generation and make it cleaner and greener? And this is really where renewable energy, which accounts for about 25% of the total installed capacity, that is likely to increase substantially to about 44% by 2040. And coal and oil and gas are likely to come down, but still be, by the way, quite sizable, still be almost half the total electricity mix, even 20, 25 years later. Now, of course, these are all forecasts that are changing, right? As technology evolves, as new urgency gets felt and new policy making paradigms come in. For example, a change in the US political system, is again causing us to look at some of these numbers more critically to try to see what more can the world do to move faster in this direction. So these numbers are, of course, subject to change, but that's the trajectory that we are looking at right now. Now, in terms of this overall situation, therefore, renewable electricity has to go from being, renewable energy has to go from being renewable electricity to becoming renewable energy and become much broader and start taking over the aspect of transportation and industry as well, which today it is not doing. So therefore, in short, two energy transitions taking place right now. One, increasing share of renewables in electricity, and two, increasing electrification of the energy sector itself. So that's the second transition that is happening. So both of these are playing out simultaneously. And frankly, till 2-3 years ago, at a point when renewable energy was more expensive than coal-based power, this was not something that could be thought about, right? But today, renewables has become a lot cheaper than coal-based power. And therefore, you can start visualizing how some of these transitions, will play out. They're becoming a lot more concrete and tangible. And this is really the real value of a lot of the technology development that we've had over the last decade in renewable energy. And this is really what that is, which is that the solar photovoltaic LCOE costs or levelized cost of energy have come down to almost a seventh of what the costs were 10 years ago. And in wind as well, costs have come down by 52% in the last 10 years. And it is these very steep reductions that have happened that are in fact allowing us to now contemplate a very different energy future than we were able to do literally 10 years ago. And that to me is a very, very important aspect of finding the solutioning toolkit for dealing with climate change. Now, how does this pertain to India? And why is India such an important aspect of this whole energy and therefore carbon debate? Now, if you look at India, India's primary energy consumption is only about 5.8% of the world's energy consumption, which is almost a fifth that of China's, which is not unusual because India's per capita income is about a fifth that of China's, and the populations are more or less the same. And so therefore, you can imagine that if per capita incomes or energy consumption is in line with per capita incomes, then that's a very natural difference to have. Now, the issue is that however India's GDP is growing rapidly and is likely to grow very rapidly over the next many years. And this 5.8% therefore is likely to grow. Now, if you look at the electricity consumption, India's as an indicator of energy consumption, you see that India's electricity consumption at 1100 units per person per year is a third that of the world average. Now, if I take out India from the world average, because India is 1/6 of humanity, the world average is probably closer to 4,000. And so we're actually almost a quarter of the rest of the world average. Now, if over the next few years, India tries to move itself to closer to the world average, our primary electricity and let's say as a proxy, energy consumption is also going to grow 4 times. That 5.8% of the previous page will become 15 or 20%. Now, therefore, the biggest energy consumption in the world over the next several years incremental energy consumption will come from India. And therefore, the choices that India makes on its own decisions on how this energy should be generated will have the most consequential impact on carbon emissions and climate change, therefore, compared to almost anything else. So I would say, these decisions of the trajectory that India chooses is probably one of the 3 or 4 most consequential decisions on the world's ability to deal with climate change, as much as anything else is. Now, again, this just shows the fact that we are going to consume, at least in the next 10 years itself, our consumption of electricity is likely to grow. And even if 50% of this comes from renewable energy, now to relate that to renewable energy, it will require 350 gigawatts of additional renewable energy capacity. And that will require an investment of $500 billion. Now, that's not going to happen by itself. It's going to require a tremendous amount of effort in managing the grid, in making the transmission investments, and of course, making investments in the renewable energy side of the mix. And so therefore, as we look towards this, sort of deconstruct this into the renewable energy side of the story in India, what are the consequences of that? There are various things that India has to do to address some of these issues. What are those? Number one, we have to have much smarter policy making because technology is evolving very rapidly. We are going to face, as I said earlier, grid intermittency issues. We are going to be looking at how to manage the grid, and therefore storage decisions, technology policies around storage. As renewables continues to change in terms of cost and the dynamic and the relative dynamic of that with coal and other forms of electricity changes, how should all of that be configured? Are decisions that the governments will have to make, not just the central government, but state governments as well, over the next several years. And so therefore, those policies are going to be very critical. The second thing is the whole issue about the utilities. The utilities in India actually today are in very poor financial shape. And therefore, we really need reform of that whole sector. The third thing really is around the manufacturing side. Now, a view that India can take is that, look, this is a change that is being foisted upon us. It's not something that we would like to do. And therefore, take a slightly more defensive position on rolling out renewable energy and so on. Or as a country, we can say, look, this is a change that is going to happen. It's inevitable. And because we have such a large domestic market, can we not develop a whole ecosystem of manufacturing as well and really lean into this change and take advantage of this change and become a global manufacturer, just like China has done, rather than take a more defensive backseat posture? And I think that is really something that the government has to think deeply about and really figure out how they can incentivize the whole ecosystem, the whole value chain of getting renewable capacity up, including manufacturing, batteries, etc. And of course, the government has taken a number of steps in this area, and I'll be happy to talk about that later. The other thing is, as we discussed, transportation accounts for 30% of energy consumption or generation and consumption, and therefore carbon emissions. We already are beginning to find solutions to electric vehicles. How can that actually be improved and increased? Can we not have a faster shift towards electric vehicles? At least take the land aspect of it, even if we can't take maritime or civil aviation, can we at least take the surface transport, public and private transportation, and move that, have bigger mandates for electric vehicle rollouts? Similarly, on industrial processes, which is another big consumer of energy, can we mandate again green hydrogen, because hydrogen is a big aspect of energy consumption by industries? Can we mandate green hydrogen? can we figure out how we can actually move some other aspects of cement companies, steel companies, etc., towards mandating them also to move more towards clean energy rather than the use of the current capacities of electricity generation that they have. And again, here there are 4 industrial sectors that consume the largest amount, or that consume 3/4 of industrial energy. Those are steel, cement, aluminum, and oil refining. Those 4 sectors are the ones that, as I said earlier, consume 3/4 of all power consumed in the industrial sector. So if we can look at those sectors specifically and mandate harder norms on those industries, can we in fact have a faster shift even in that bucket of the energy consumption? And lastly, of course, we need storage, because storage is critical in making this whole transition happen. And therefore, how can we look at different kinds of energy solutions? So to my mind, in some ways, this really was a 6 point toolkit that the Indian government should be looking at to really move faster towards renewable energy and and also faster towards more electrification of the energy sector, so that even as India's energy demand grows in the next several decades, it does not do so in a manner that is going to be harmful towards carbon emissions, and actually can be done in a way which takes advantage of the opportunities that are going to be created by this whole transition that we're in the midst of, that we don't necessarily fully realize at this point in time. And so therefore, really, that was my overall thesis, which is that climate change is real and it does need to be addressed immediately. There is no time. Current global efforts are clearly not enough. If we carry on this way, we're looking at a 3.5 to 4 degrees centigrade temperature change, which is going to lead to catastrophic climate change events. Countries like India are particularly vulnerable, and therefore we have to take a stronger, more forward-looking, more leaning in kind of an approach to the whole area of climate change, and really use it as an advantage and become a leader in the whole area of climate change, and really go for what I call carbon light, but really eventually has to become a carbon-free type of a growth going forward. And that is really what I was trying to talk about in the book, which is why I called it fossil-free, because that's the future that we have to envision for ourselves going forward, and particularly for growing countries like India, which are large, which are at the cusp of a massive development surge. We have to make the right decisions. Thank you. So let me stop here, Laurie, and hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very compelling and succinct. I think you've managed to summarize some of the largest challenges, if not all, that we face on this path. It was a wonderful, wonderful summary, Sumant. I'd like to delve into some of those issues in the time remaining that are particularly, I think, difficult for countries not like India and others that we're facing. In one of the ways you talked about this future that we need to create in the book that jumped out at me was you described the world needing a new, resilient, water-conserving, post-oil, post-coal, post-nuclear economy, which is what you're talking about here. And these challenges of what we need to create as with regard to renewable energy around intermittency, for example, and grid expansion, and these stranded assets that we have in particular. One of the things that jumps out at me is that this transition that India will have to implement in it, much as we face in the United States and in other countries, implies dramatic changes for the livelihoods of many, many people, for example, involved in the coal economy. I know that India relies heavily on coal currently and coal power generation, and that involves livelihoods of potentially hundreds of thousands of people. How do you believe that could be addressed? I know that that's a huge challenge and will have to be managed. Do you have any thoughts that you could share on that topic?
Yeah, look, Laurie, that's a very tough question to actually answer. And I'm glad I'm not the one who has to take decisions on figuring out solutions for this issue. But I think the first step is, the problem already exists. Let's not make the problem any worse by increasing the coal sector, right? So I think we should just freeze the levels that we have right now, right? So I think that should be in some ways step one. Step two is that, look, coal is not going away anytime soon at this point in time, sadly, right? It's going to be there for the next 30, 40 years at least, because, I don't think power systems and energy systems can transition at a rate faster than that. So there is going to be a significant period of time during which we have, within which renewable energy solutions continue to increase and technology continues to increase. Grid management, becomes easier, and so on. So I would say that whole transition will take us maybe 20 to 30 years, right? I'm just hazarding a guess here, but for us to start replacing, for example, India's existing coal fleet, which is about 200,000 megawatts totally, will require an investment of or a putting up of almost 600,000 megawatts of renewables to replace that coal fleet. That's going to take a lot of time, because right now the total amount of capacity we're adding in renewables in India is really meant to take care of our incremental demand growth. Replacing existing capacities will take us another significant time. So we have some time. In that time, the government has to recognize that we need to start figuring out what are the solutions that we can implement for the people who are employed in this sector. And that could be large retraining programs. It could be moving those people away from wherever they are to other areas, which is going to be very hard to do. Because the reality also is that, a lot of these people actually live around the coal mining areas. And those coal mining areas are going to be no longer relevant from a solar or wind standpoint. And so the jobs that you'll create will not be geographically in the same area. So it's not just that you can just retrain them, you also have to relocate them. And so that's going to add to the problem as well, because a lot of people, are attached to where they are. So it's a very tough thing. And I think the government has to come out with real plans about incentivizing the setting up of manufacturing capacities in areas where you have coal at this point in time. And if governments don't do that today, then you'll start having a very serious problem over time of how you retrain and reabsorb these people into other parts of the sector. And for that reason, and if you don't do that, you'll continue to actually have the coal sector, because you can't do away with those jobs. And therefore, that will always be in some ways a lock-in to get away from the coal sector. And so that's going to be one of the most difficult aspects, actually. So I don't have an answer for you, unfortunately.
No, but I think you summarized the challenges, and I think you pointed towards the answer, which is a long-term policy solution and working with those communities. So thank you. I think you've summarized it and pointed towards the potential solutions in a very succinct way. I'd like to touch on another really important element of renewables rollout, and this comes from my own background in renewable energy development, which is intermittency. And the importance of managing intermittency in order to increase the amount of renewables. How is Renew as a company thinking about that and managing it in terms of the design of its facilities?
Yeah, so right now renewables in India is only about 10% of the total electricity generation. So it's a fairly small number. And that is something that can be fairly easily absorbed into the grid without too many issues. Now, having said that, 10 years later, that number will be 30-35%. And you will have problems about absorbing all this intermittency. And you'll also have problems about absorbing all the solar capacity that we're putting up, because it'll peak in the middle of the day and there won't be sufficient demand. And so we'll have to have storage-based solutions. So I think we need a number of different things to be done. Number one, on the demand management side, we need to be able to shape the demand side of the curve a little bit towards fitting in more closely with the generation side. So I think that's one thing that we need to do. So time of day pricing, encouraging people to operate their factories and stuff like that at different points of the day. All of those things, I think, charging their cars perhaps at night rather than in the daytime, or more in the daytime rather than at the nighttime, sorry. So those kinds of things, I think, are going to be important. The second thing is we need to figure out what kind of a storage strategy we require, because and that answer is going to keep changing also over time. And this is really where this whole issue that I talked about, which is nifty policy making, is very critical, because the solutioning and therefore the policy interventions will keep changing over time that are required. Because in the beginning, you'll have relatively less storage required to be able to absorb this power. But let's say 10 years later, you'll require much more storage to handle to find solutions. And so therefore, whether you put those storage solutions up close to demand centers or close to generation centers? Should you have a separate ancillary market for batteries, or should you club it with the generation side? Those decisions will have to be taken by the government. And those will keep changing also as costs of technology keep coming down. Because today, perhaps you start small on batteries because costs are higher, but then you have a clear roadmap that as costs keep coming down and as the percentage of renewables in the grid increases, this is the way we're going to manage that. So I think what we are doing as a company clearly is that we recognize that storage is going to become a very big issue going forward. So we are investing in developing capabilities on the battery side. We won't get into manufacturing batteries because that's a whole different business by itself. But certainly on developing the right software solutions, the right matching of the generation side with storage solutions in a way that brings down the cost as much as possible. Those are solutions that we're definitely working on. But a lot of thinking has to evolve in this area right now. That is not there yet, simply because it's still at fairly early stages of the battery business.
Excellent. Yeah, you made some comments that I thought were very interesting in the book about how you believe that intermittency will cease to be a problem between 2024 and 2026, which
That's
I found.
Right. I think, yeah, just looking at the trajectory of how battery pricing is going, and literally in the last 2-3 years, the cost of batteries have halved. Just extending that out a little bit further, and also looking at the cost reduction in renewables. My sense is that renewables plus storage will become competitive with baseload power in the next 5 to 6 years. And then you can actually potentially just have renewables with batteries rather than anything else, essentially. And the other thing is how you combine wind and solar together, because if you combine wind and solar together, then you already have a little bit more of a managed curve. Now, again, you can do this at the overall grid level, at the national level, or you can do it at a state level, or you can do it at the generation level. So again, the government has to decide how they want to approach this whole thing. Today, they're looking at going at the generation level. And so at the generation level, it's up to us to find the right kinds of solutions.
And if you're going to do that at the grid level, at the state level or at the grid level, depending on your grid, you of course need proper build out of that grid and debottlenecking of that grid and a certain level of sophistication of management of the grid, which I think is where we need to go. That's
right. And I think there are several aspects of it. Number one is obviously the physical build out of the grid itself, that the wires need to be there to carry the power from one part of the one location to another location. So I think on that front, at least India seems to be well prepared and is seeming to be doing a good job. The second aspect is the softer aspect of the software, the whole demand supply management, the plotting of the curves and making sure that everything is aligned, that you have the flexibility of dialing up and dialing down different sources of generation. So that's an area that we really need to do a lot more work in. And today, I think if you look at the various states, because this is done mostly at a state level, there is the institutional capacity to deal with some of these intermittency issues is not very high. There needs to be a lot more work to be done in this area to absorb more renewable energy. And we've seen countries in the Western world, Europe and so on, where just through better management at a regional level, the level of renewables in the grid has gone up to about 30-35% or even 40%, even without a significant amount of storage, right? So I think there is a natural ability to get to that point just through better management of the whole grid. So I think that's the second aspect of it. The third, of course, is then coming out with all of these new strategies around storage and figuring out how that might be able to impact some of these things as well. And as I said, that answer continues to change on a dynamic basis because the costs keep coming down. And so therefore, and the availability goes up. And so that's why it's very hard for policymakers, because they have to necessarily create forward-looking policy where they have to look at what's going to happen 3 or 5 years out, and then factor all of that into the decision making, rather than looking at the situation as it exists today. Because today is not going to be the same as tomorrow, as we've seen in renewables over the last so many years, right? Tomorrow is going to be very different, and policies would take time to get developed and implemented. So you're trying to get two things to converge 2-3 years later: a view on technology and a view on how your policies will impact everything. And so therefore, it's a little bit difficult. And this is really where enlightened and what I said, nifty policy making is so critical, because you can't develop policies for today, as of today's situation, when the future is going to be so markedly different.
I agree. I also think that the knowledge is out there. One of the challenges, I believe, is having, particularly when power markets are managed at a state level, is connecting those state level authorities with other power markets, potentially in other countries, for sharing of knowledge, for development of ancillary services, for development of those policies. And it can be done, but it's very challenging. And having worked in different countries and interacted with regulatory bodies in those countries, I think it would be something we could perhaps talk about how to foster those relationships and get people talking across international borders, because there is a lot of knowledge to be shared institution to institution. And the development of particularly those regulatory bodies in and of themselves, getting peers talking to one another, and there are associations that do that, but there's a way to do, I believe, foster that communication for the good of those power markets. And I think the challenge is at the regulatory level.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And to me, this is something that has to go to the subnational level, because for example, in India, power is what is called a concurrent subject, which means both the central and the state governments have a say. But state governments have a say at the local level, at the state level. The central government can only create guidelines. If state governments are not as enlightened as the central government is, if state governments don't understand climate change imperatives, right, and they don't decide to invest on developing their capabilities on the regulatory front, as you said, then a lot of this stuff is just going to fall by the wayside. And so you're absolutely right that we really need to encourage cooperation at now multiple levels across various countries. For example, why can't we have cooperation between various, some Indian states and US states like California or New York, which are much, let's say, further along the curve on the development of power markets or thinking through the future of how things might evolve. And we need those kinds of dialogues and conversations to happen. And so therefore we need a Glasgow where it's the state governments that come together and discuss things, right? Rather than only nation states coming together. Because I think nation states get it, most of them at least. And so therefore they will do what has to be done. But I think we need something else where, a separate kind of a COP where it's just, COP for states or subnational areas or something like that.
Well, I think that's something we can certainly talk about. And with those of us on this call, I think there's a lot that we could arrange. So we'll have to get moving on that. I'd be very interested. I think that there's a lot to be done. And particularly on some of those other topics that you mentioned, it goes beyond just power generation, right? It moves into those hard to abate sectors. It moves into how to abate those industrial sectors such as cement and steel and aluminum. And there's a lot to be done, I believe, at the subnational level with those sectors as well, because there's a lot going on in different parts of the world at the subnational level in those areas, and I think that connections can be made. This is, emissions do not respect borders. Emissions are not concerned about politics. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to find ways to make connections and get people talking. Pierre and I spend quite a bit of time chatting about this at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And I think that's one of the real missions that as an organization we have is to try to bring people together and in discussions. And we don't necessarily have to agree. It's even better when we don't, because then we find better solutions. And I have to say, your book really got me thinking about the connections between the technology piece and the, challenges. I have to bring it up, your conclusions around nuclear. Please share with us your thoughts there, because that's a debate we have in the organization a lot as to whether or not nuclear needs to be a part of the solution.
My feeling on nuclear is, for example, that it is ultimately people are driven by commercial interests as much as by anything else. And especially in countries that are not as prosperous, costs become a very big aspect of a solution. Now, if you look at India, for example, solar can be set up at 2.5 rupees a unit. Wind can be set up at 3 rupees a unit. Coal is at about between 4 and 5 rupees a unit. So both wind and solar are significantly cheaper than coal. So I think that's going to be the biggest driver for coal capacities not to get put up in the future, apart from the fact that nobody wants to finance it and so on. It's just more expensive now, right? Now, if you look at hydro, it's very hard to build hydro. It takes many years. There are all sorts of environmental issues and so on. But nuclear, unfortunately, is very expensive. And, I haven't seen any latest numbers, but from whatever I understand, nuclear would be about 7 or 8 rupees at least per unit, per kilowatt hour. And so therefore, if nuclear is 7 or 8 rupees and your solar and wind are at 2.5 to 3 rupees, why should anybody want to put up nuclear? Now, at least these are the cost dynamics in India. The cost dynamics in other parts of the world may be different. On top of that, you have fuel supply issues. On top of that, you have NIMBY issues, and you have very large size investments required, which most private companies can't put in, because it requires billions and billions of dollars. On the other hand, renewables is much more modular, much more flexible, much shorter gestation time periods, and 50 companies can be setting up wind farms and solar farms, but maybe only 1 or 2 very large government-owned type companies can set up nuclear. So for all of those reasons, my feeling is that nuclear may not be a very big part of the solution. And then keep in mind one more thing, that what you require in the grid today more than anything else is you need flexibility, right? And nuclear needs to operate at a certain minimum size or a certain minimum generation level. So actually it's inflexible. So you have to keep operating it at a certain minimum level. And the same thing applies actually to coal-based plants as well, which is, yes, it is baseload power, but you can't dial it down below a certain level. So you don't get that flexibility from it. But between wind and solar on the one hand and storage, you can generate that flexibility. So therefore, the question is, to my mind, I don't think that nuclear will be a big part of the solution going forward. Certainly not in countries like India, where fuel supply and fuel, allocation or disposal becomes an issue as well.
Thank you. That is, the economic driver argument certainly makes sense, particularly in the developing world. So appreciate it. Thank you very much. I do believe that we are coming close to the end of our time. I could continue speaking. We have a number of questions that we were unable to get to. I have been trying to weave them into the discussion, the questions from the Q&A. So I think we need to do another event. I think it's clear. So we'll keep track of these questions and save them for next time.
Sure, no, absolutely.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to the next opportunity. And Pierre, fortunately, I get to talk to you a lot more often.
Which is my pleasure.
So thank you, everyone. It's been delightful. And Sumant, I look forward to seeing you again soon, hopefully here in New York.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie. I look forward to seeing you as well, and to meet Pierre as well. And look, my feeling is that, you guys, because you have your Columbia Global Centers, and of course you have your Global Energy Policy Center, you actually can play a very fundamental role in getting a lot of these subnational conversations going.
We look forward to it. I think that's an excellent idea, and certainly a project that we should begin working on. And I will reach out to your office to see how we can do it together.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a distinct pleasure.